Hello everyone! The majority of patch 5.3 was dominated by the new 5-star releases of Mavuika and Citlali, but the second half of the patch is also notable as both Arlecchino and Clorinde are having their first rerun banners. Both Arlecchino and Clorinde were considered good DPSs on their release, with Arlecchino competing with Neuvillette as the best DPS in the game for a long time. But have they held up against the competition with the continuation of newly released 5-star DPSs? To answer this question, I wanted to discuss how Arlecchino and Clorinde have aged since their initial release by analyzing their current strengths, weaknesses, and overall meta pull value in the context of their rerun banners to help you better decide whether or not pulling on these banners is the right decision for you. Let's first talk about Arlecchino. Arlecchino is still one of the best DPSs in the game. Even though she does have the downside of not being able to be healed in combat due to her special Bond of Life mechanic, in return Arlecchino dishes out a lot of damage due to her high multipliers, and this damage is not burst reliant as all you need is her skill and normal attacks. She's one of the few pyro main DPSs that is strong in almost every single pyro related team comp. In contrast to someone like Hu Tao, who is typically only a vape carry, Arlecchino can work well in mono pyro teams, Chevos Overload teams, vape teams, and melt teams. Mono pyro is pretty straightforward. You just rely on raw pyro damage with buffs from supports like Bennett and either an Animo or Geo support of your choice. You can also sub in Emily to play Burning or the double Geo core with Chiori, adding in raw off-field Dendro or Geo damage to the comp. Chevros Overload works similarly, allowing Chevros to buff the raw pyro and electro damage on your team as long as you trigger overloads. The overloads do deal a small chunk of damage, but the most important part is the buffs that Chevros brings to the team. And if you have Chevros' C6, this is definitely one of Arlecchino's best team comps. Next, vape teams have typically been Arlecchino's best teams for damage by allowing her to multiply her high damage by triggering Vaporize. Double Hydro is definitely usable, but the standard best vape team is with Bennett, Yelan as the off-field Hydro, and a Geo support like Xilonen or Zhongli, or an Animo support like Kazuha, Sucrose, or Lan Yan. Lastly, melt teams with Arlecchino were only okay for the majority of the time that Arlecchino existed in the game, because the only off-field cryo sources we had were Rosaria and Kaya. And since these units aren't the greatest when compared to other meta supports, you would rather play another team comp instead of melt. But with the release of Citlali, forward melt Arlecchino teams are quite strong and can now compete with her other top meta teams. Not only does Citlali provide Pyro Red Shred and 4-piece scroll, but also her off-field cryo application alone can drive Arlecchino melts. However, you'll need to do some specific combos with specific timings to allow Arlecchino to melt her attacks properly. One combo is to, after setting up your support skills, cancel the charged attack damage of Arlecchino when you charged attack to consume her mark to gain Bond of Life to avoid that additional pyro application. Once you cancel the charge attack and your Arlecchino actually has Bond of Life, you can do 3 normal attacks and dash cancel, repeating that for a total of 6 times before swapping out. Your goal here is to have her first normal attack in the chain melt, so you have to look, wait, and see when cryo is applied onto the enemy before starting your N3D in order to time the melts correctly. This combo can be tight on the timing and execution, so an easier combo you can perform is to do Arlecchino's charge attack normally, wait until you see cryo applied onto the enemy, then do 5 normal attacks and end with a dash cancel, repeating this attack chain for a total of 3 times. As long as you wait for cryo to be applied the first time around, the rest of your attack should line up well with Citlali's cryo application. With some practice for Arlecchinos that aren't C2 or over, these combos can be practically performed in combat, allowing you to properly play melt Arlecchino with just Citlali as your off-field cryo. So overall, Arlecchino is an incredibly strong pyro main DPS at C0 with plenty of solid team options. And for those of you looking to vertically invest, her C1 is one of the strongest cons in the game in terms of a damage gain over C0, on top of giving Arlecchino resistance to interruption. And C2 allows her to do an extra nuke of damage, so with proper reaction setup, you'll get even more damage. However, although Arlecchino has herself gotten better with the release of new supports like Citlali and Xilonen, her role as a pyro main DPS got some big competition with the release of Mavuika, and the main discussion about these two is whether or not Mavuika straight up power creeps Arlecchino. And while this discussion could go on forever, I will summarize their main differences here. Both Arlecchino and Mavuika work well in the same team comps: Mono Pyro, Chevros Overload, Vape, and Melt. However, because of Mavuika's big initial burst damage, she is really incentivized to play and shines in reaction-based teams like Melt and Vape. Arlecchino is very strong in reaction teams, but her kit also makes her more suited for the non-reaction based teams like Mono Pyro and Chevros Overload more than Mavuika. Next, because of Mavuika's fighting spirit mechanic, she is more teammate and burst reliant, while Arlecchino's kit makes her better in solo and multi-wave scenarios, while also being a bit more flexible in team building. However, Mavuika has much more quality of life in her kit. While Arlecchino cannot get healed and doesn't get resistance resistance to interruption without a shielder or C1, Mavuika can get healed, has resistance to interruption during her burst duration, and has a very big AoE on her charged attacks. However, the biggest difference between Arlecchino and Mavuika is that based on the team damage calcs, Mavuika just has higher numbers and generally does more damage than Arlecchino at equal investment. Mavuika's melt teams are by far the highest damaging teams we've seen released in Genshin so far, and even in the teams that you would consider Mavuika to be less optimal like Vape and Chevre's Overload, she still does insane amounts of damage and is arguably still ahead than Arlecchino in those comps. In fact, even if your Arlecchino is either C1 or has her signature, her best team damage is just about equal to Mavuika's best melt team, even with the T0 Mavuika without her signature. Mavuika is just that ahead in damage. Combined with the fact that Mavuika doesn't have the downsides of not being able to be healed like Arlecchino, based on the damage numbers, which is the main comparison between DPSs, Mavuika does power creep Arlecchino, and this isn't even taking into account Mavuika being used as an off-field support. However, that doesn't mean that Arlecchino is necessarily a bad pull now, especially if you don't care for strict meta. Mavuika may be the new best DPS, but Arlecchino is still arguably the second or third best DPS in the game, which is still really good, especially if your account is lacking a strong carry. And as the most recent Abyss buffs have shown, you can still easily run both an Arlecchino and Mavuika team in Abyss and sweep through any endgame content. Next, let's go over the second limited 5-star rerunning, Clorinde. Clorinde has always been a decent DPS, and compared to Arlecchino's Bond of Life mechanic preventing her from healing, Clorinde's Bond of Life mechanic actually gives her a bit of self-healing. She shares the same role and some similar teams as Raiden, and overall Clorinde is just a better DPS than Raiden due to her being a newer 5-star with higher numbers, making Clorinde the best 5-star Electro main DPS in the game. When comparing her to other DPSs in the game though, her damage is good but nothing that amazing. For people really focused on the highest damaging teams in the game, Clorinde isn't going to give you those high numbers at higher investment that a character like Arlecchino or Mavuika would. With this min-max mindset, Clorinde's damage can be viewed as kinda mid, and this isn't necessarily wrong. However, Clorinde's biggest strength is her vast team building options that are all strong choices. She is typically played in 4 main team comps: Aggravate, Quick Bloom, Electrocharge, and Chevre's Overload. The Dendro teams are pretty self-explanatory. Both have a Dendro unit and a second Electro, and if you're running Aggravate, an Anima support is very good, and if you're running Quick Bloom, you'll run an off-field Hydro like Farina or Yalan. With the release of Auroron and the damage buffs to the Electrocharged reaction, Electrocharge Clorinde teams are a pretty good option as well. While these teams will be worst in single target due to the AoE nature of Electrocharged, with multiple enemies, this team comp is quite potent. Lastly, just like Arlecchino, Chevre's Overload is one of Clorinde's best team comps, especially with Chevre C6 due to her buffing capabilities. And with the release of Mavuika and Pyro MC, this team arguably got stronger with them as they can hold 4P scroll and be the second Pyro character providing off-field Pyro. And in terms of constellations, typically post-Fontaine 5-star DPS constellations are strong, and Clorinde is no different. If you're looking for vertical investment, both C1 and C2 are nice damage boosts for her. Commonly, a DPS will have a team archetype that is ahead of the others. For instance, even though Mavuika is strong in Melt, Vape, and Chevre's Overload, her main strength is in specifically Melt teams. In Clorinde's case, however, with the exception of Electrocharge being slightly worse in single target, all of Clorinde's team comps are similar in strength, making her very flexible in team building. But in my opinion, Clorinde's main strength that makes her a versatile DPS is that she's one of the only pure attack scaling carries that isn't Bennett reliant. Now when I mean a character is reliant on Bennett, I mean that a character relies on having Bennett on their team to greatly increase their damage. For example, even though Mavuika and Arlecchino definitely do enough damage without Bennett to clear anything, so they don't necessarily need Bennett to be playable, the fact is that without Bennett's attack buff, their teams deal considerably lower damage, so I would consider Mavuika and Arlecchino reliant on Bennett. For almost every pure attack scaling main DPS, this is the case, but for Clorinde, not so much. Obviously, her Dendro related and Electrocharge teams can't fit in a Pyro unit, but even for Chevre's Overload, while Bennett is a good option in this team, there are factors that make him a bit awkward to use. For one, without any source of off-field Pyro, it's hard to trigger overloads to maintain Chevre's buffs, a problem that is very evident in multi-wave scenarios. However, the main reason that Clorinde isn't that Bennett reliant is because of her A1 passive. To put it simply, Clorinde gains more damage on her primary attacks based on how much attack she has, but this buff caps out at 3000 attack. Bennett gives a huge attack buff and will easily take Clorinde over 3000 attack. However, while any attack over 3000 is still useful and will boost her damage, this attack over 3000 won't be considered into her A1 passive, which makes up a considerable part of Clorinde's damage multipliers. Thus, Clorinde doesn't take full advantage of Bennett's buff, making her less reliant on him for damage. And with the majority of the attack scaling DPSs in this game wanting Bennett for his buff, having a character that doesn't really need him is amazing for team building, allowing you to free Bennett up for another team. So despite Clorinde not not having the highest damage among top tier DPSs, if you're looking for a versatile carry, Clorinde can be helpful to an account. Now, will Clorinde remain the best 5-star Electro DPS in the game? With the rate of power creep ramping up in Genshin and Ian-san coming out around the corner as the potential new 5-star Electro DPS, I wouldn't be surprised if she gets outclassed. However, she'll still have her team building flexibility, and she has the strength of actually attacking a lot of times in her normal combo, which is extremely helpful for all those Night Soul aligned shields that Hoyoverse seems to love putting in Abyss recently. If you're not interested in the limited 5 stars, you may want to consider still pulling on the banner because the 4-star lineup is actually quite good, which is a rare occurrence. Starting off with Rosaria, I would consider her the worst 4-star here, but she's still relatively useful. I consider her the best 4-star cryo sub DPS we have, who is fine in freeze and can be a decent alternative for Citlali in melt teams. C2 is all you ideally need to extend her burst duration. Next, with Arlecchino and Clorinde being great in Chevreuse overload teams, it makes sense that Chevreuse is featured on the banner, and she's one of the best 4-stars in the game by enabling a very strong team archetype for Pyro and Electro DPSs. All you need is a C0 Chevreuse in order to start playing the team, but if you manage to get her C6 for even more buffs, Chevreuse overload teams start to become one of the top meta teams in the game. Lastly, Lan Yan is Genshin's first and most shielder, and she's a pretty strong support as well. I made a complete guide on her covering detailed builds, teams, and meta analysis, so I highly suggest checking that video for more info on her. To summarize her value here, Lan Yan combines the buff from 4-piece Veritas Invenerer with the defensive utility of a shield. The ability to consolidate both of these roles into a single unit, along with providing additional buffs like TTDS's attack buff, opens up a lot of team building options for a lot of team archetypes. Thus, despite Lan Yan not being the theoretical best in slot for teams, her flexibility in team building makes her an amazing 4-star support, and her attack scaling shield is pretty strong. If you manage to get her C2, which allows you to restore her shield's HP with normal attacks, her shield strength can match and even surpass Zhongli's shield. So if you are relatively low on your 5-star pity for the limited character banners, I highly suggest thinking about spending some pools to potentially get some of these strong 4-star characters. Lastly, let's quickly go over the weapon banner. To be frank, I don't think this banner is very good. Both Arlecchino's and Clorinde's signature weapons are significant upgrades for them. However, because their special passives require Bond of Life, they aren't really versatile weapons and should only be used on Arlecchino and Clorinde respectively. In addition, because their constellations are also strong, you may want to consider pulling their constellations instead. For instance, even though Arlecchino's C1 and signature gives similar damage boosts, C1 also gives resistance to interruption, so unless you want that scythe drip, I would recommend getting C1 first for the quality of life. However, the main reason this weapon banner isn't very good is because of the 4-star weapon lineup. Lion's Roar is kinda bad, Lithic Spear is alright, but you likely won't have that many leeway characters on your team and it's hard to get R5 of it. Sacrificial Bow can be useful with its higher base attack and ER substat, but there's not that many characters in the game that uses passive well, and Favonia's bow is generally a better support bow. Rain Slasher can be useful on Claymore carries and vape teams like Plunge Vape Gaming or D-Luke, but there are better Claymore options like Serpent Spine. And lastly, the best weapon here is probably Widsith, which is a good DPS catalyst, but it has an RG passive that can make its performance worse if you just hit the wrong buff. So you should really only pull on this banner if you really want Arlecchino's or Clorinde signatures. Without any good 4-star weapons like Favonia's weapons, you aren't going to get that many valuable 4-star weapons from this banner. And that's everything I wanted to cover on Arlecchino and Clorinde's current meta state and the value of the rerun banner. I hope this analysis was helpful to you all. If you like this type of content, leave a like and subscribe to the channel. Feel free to leave your thoughts and any questions in the comments below, and for those of you pulling, I wish you all the best of luck on your wishes.